He chose his mistress in public, then his wife exposed the plot that controlled them all. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull her aside. Dante Veyron stood at the head of a room full of killers, lawyers, and men who'd buried bodies for him, and he reached across the silence and took Maribel Cross by the hand like he was claiming something that had always belonged to him. Every eye in that ballroom swung toward Serafina, his wife, the woman who had stood beside him through prison threats, federal investigations, 3 assassination attempts, and the kind of grief that hollows people out. She stood there in a black evening gown, with her hands loose at her sides and her face giving nothing away, and the entire room waited for her to break. She didn't break. She reached down, slid her wedding ring off her finger, and set it on the white tablecloth, like she was leaving a tip. Then, "You've just made your first mistake," she said. Not loudly, not with venom, just the way a woman says something she already knows is true. Dante expected rage. He got a smile instead. And as Serafina walked out of that ballroom with her head up and her spine straight, something shifted in the room that no one could name yet. If you're watching this story unfold for the first time, do yourself a favor, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part of what's coming. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Like this video if you're already feeling it. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about who was really in control. Serafina Vale was 31 years old when she married Dante Veyron, and she had known exactly what she was walking into. That was the part people always got wrong about her. They assumed she'd been naive, some beautiful woman swept up in a powerful man's orbit, too dazzled to see clearly. The truth was considerably more complicated and considerably less flattering to Dante. She had walked into that marriage with her eyes open, with a plan already forming in the back of her mind, and with a quiet understanding that the Veyron family was sitting on top of something rotten that would eventually devour itself. She had simply decided, for reasons she kept locked away, even from herself, that she was not going to let it devour Dante before she figured out what was worth saving. 7 years. That was how long she had been inside that world. 7 years of family dinners where men discussed violence the way other men discussed sports. 7 years of watching Dante trust people he should have questioned and question people he should have trusted. 7 years of understanding, slowly and then all at once, that someone had been pulling strings inside the Veyron organization long before she arrived, and that Dante was either too proud or too distracted to see the wires attached to his own arms. The night of the ballroom, she had been ready. She had not been ready to feel it. The way she felt it, that particular burn of public humiliation, is its own animal. And knowing something is coming does not armor you against the moment it arrives. When Dante took Maribel's hand, she felt it in her sternum, a dull impact, like being struck by something soft that still left a bruise. She had looked at Maribel briefly. Maribel Cross was gorgeous, in the way expensive things are gorgeous, polished, and deliberate, with the kind of composure that comes from either genuine confidence or very careful coaching. Serafina had not been able to determine which, even after months of watching her. She had set down the ring and walked out because staying would have served no purpose, and because she needed Dante to believe, at least for a little while, that she was wounded, that she was retreating. People underestimate retreating women. That is something Serafina had learned early and used often. Car was already waiting outside. Not one of Dante's cars. Her own, registered under a name she had used for 4 years, and that appeared nowhere in the Veyron family's records. The driver, a quiet man named Curtis, who had worked for her since before she married Dante, pulled out of the circular drive without being told where to go. He already knew. Serafina sat in the back seat and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose and breathed. She allowed herself 90 seconds. That was the rule she had made for herself. Long ago, 90 seconds, to feel whatever you actually feel, and then you put it away and you move. She felt the humiliation. She felt something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. She felt underneath all of it a thin, sharp thread of fear, because the plan she had been building for 3 years was now in motion, and plans in motion have a way of developing their own momentum, and she could not afford a single miscalculation. 90 seconds. Then she opened the leather case on the seat beside her, confirmed that everything inside was where it should be, and told Curtis to drive. Back inside the ballroom, Dante was already regretting the night. Not the decision, not yet. Not fully, but the execution of it. He had made it too public. He knew that the moment the room fell silent, and he saw the expression on the faces of men who had known him for 20 years. There was something in those faces that wasn't quite respect. He had taken Maribel's hand to send a message, to establish a new order of things, and instead he had created a spectacle. The Veyron family did not do spectacle. Spectacle was for people who needed to be seen. The family operated in silence and implied threat, and what Dante had done tonight was neither silent nor implied. Maribel was squeezing his hand. Her fingers were cold. "Took it well," Maribel said quietly, and there was something in her voice that Dante couldn't read. Relief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. "She doesn't take things badly," Dante said. "She just takes them differently." He was already scanning the room. His head of security, a thick-necked man named Prentice, was standing near the east exit, looking at his phone with an expression that didn't belong at a formal dinner. Dante extracted himself from Maribel and crossed the room without excusing himself, which was a habit he had never broken, and put his hand on Prentice's arm. "What?" Dante said. "It wasn't a question. Nothing confirmed yet, boss." "Prentice." Prentice turned the phone so Dante could see the screen. A text message from one of the estate's perimeter guards. "Vehicle left through the south gate. Not one of ours. Matched to a name we can't trace." Dante stared at the message for a moment. Then he looked across the now buzzing ballroom toward the door through which Serafina had walked, and something cold settled in his chest. "Find her," he said. "Already working on it." "I didn't say work on it. I said find her." He walked back toward Maribel and spent the remainder of the evening performing a version of himself that felt, for the first time in recent memory, unconvincing. The guests congratulated him. The captain shook his hand. His consigliere, Lucien Rook, appeared at his elbow sometime around midnight, with a glass of scotch and a smile that had always struck Dante as slightly too practiced to be real. Lucien was 62 years old, silver-haired, and the kind of man who made intelligence look like effortlessness. He had served the Veyron family for 28 years. Through Dante's father's reign, and through the bloody transition period that followed the old man's death, and Dante had always trusted him the way you trust a foundation wall. Not because you love it, but because it's been holding weight for so long that questioning it feels almost insulting. "Smooth evening," Lucien said. "Don't. I'm not editorializing. You always editorialize. It just sounds like observation." Dante accepted the scotch. "She left in a car we can't trace." Lucien's expression didn't change in any meaningful way, but Dante had learned, over the years, to watch the small things. The micropause before Lucien's next sip, the slight recalibration behind his eyes. "She's upset," Lucien said. "She'll surface in a day or two." "She wasn't upset. That's what's bothering me." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "You know her better than I do." "I thought I did," Dante said, and he meant it more than he intended to. He slept badly that night. In the penthouse, Maribel beside him, and somehow making the bed feel crowded in a way Serafina never had. And at 3 a.m, he got up and went to his desk because insomnia was easier to manage when you gave it something to look at. The envelope was sitting in the center of the desk blotter. His desk in a penthouse, whose access was controlled by keypad and fingerprint, in a building whose security team he paid a considerable amount of money to maintain. The envelope should not have been there. He stood in front of it for a long moment with his hands in his pockets. Then he opened it. The photograph inside was high quality, printed on the kind of paper that retains detail, not a screenshot or a phone photo, but something produced with care. Dante was in the photo, younger by maybe a decade, standing in the parking structure beneath the Atlantic Commerce Building, shaking hands with a man named Carver Wells. The date stamp in the corner was 14 years ago, 8 months before Carver Wells officially died in a boating accident off the coast of Georgia. Except that in the photograph, Carver Wells looked extremely alive, and he was handing Dante an envelope. And Dante, who remembered that night with a clarity that now felt like swallowing glass, knew exactly what had been in that envelope. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he didn't recognize, was a single line, You didn't choose her. They chose her for you. Dante sat down heavily in his desk chair and looked at the photograph for a long time. Around 4 in the morning, he made a phone call that he'd been avoiding for years to a man who answered on the second ring despite the hour, which told Dante that whoever was watching him had already made their move. His empire was very large and very complicated, and he ran it with authority and something that was often mistaken for wisdom. And he had genuinely believed, that he was the one setting the terms. The photograph suggested otherwise in a way that made his stomach drop. He did not tell Maribel. He did not call Lucian. He sat at his desk until the city outside went from black to gray to the particular orange-pink of an early morning, and he thought about Serafina's face when she set down the ring. That calm, that small, precise smile, the way she had looked at him, like she was already on the other side of something. Then you've just made your first mistake. He had assumed it was anger talking, that she was covering pain with bravado. He was beginning to understand that she had not been covering anything. She had been telling him something true, in the clearest language available to a woman who had learned not to be direct about things that mattered. He sent 6 men to find her that morning. By noon, every trail had gone cold. Serafina Vale had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. Maribel settled into the penthouse with an ease that should have been strange. Dante noticed it without initially understanding why it bothered him. She was comfortable in a way that didn't match the narrative of a woman who had just been publicly elevated and was now navigating an unfamiliar world. She moved through the space like she had studied it. She knew which doors required which codes before he told her. She asked questions about the organization that were too precise to be casual curiosity, not aggressive questions, not the kind that announced themselves as suspicious, but quiet needle-thin questions embedded in longer conversations that extracted information without appearing to try. 3 days after the ballroom, one of Dante's oldest lieutenants, a man named Ortiz, who had been with the family since before Dante's father died, requested a private meeting. Dante had known Ortiz since he was 19. He was not a man given to nerves or theater. He was dead before the meeting could happen. Found in his car outside a restaurant in the theater district. 2 shots, clean and professional. No witnesses, no useful camera footage, no message left behind, except the card the police found, tucked under his windshield wiper, not placed by the killer, but brought to Dante's attention by a contact inside the department. The card was blank, except for 5 words written in the same handwriting as the envelope on Dante's desk. Queen knows the ledger. Dante read the card and felt the first genuine fear he had experienced in years. Not the procedural fear of exposure or arrest, which was manageable because it had clear responses. It was older and more animal. The fear that something has been in your house long before you noticed the door was open. He went to his financial operations director, a woman named Strand, who ran the family's legitimate business interests, and asked her to pull everything. Every account, every transaction, every authorization signature going back a decade. Strand took 18 hours and came back, looking like she hadn't slept. There are accounts I've never seen before, she said. She put a folder on his desk. Shell companies, nested 3 and 4 levels deep. The money moved in amounts small enough not to trigger reporting, but the aggregate over 9 years is. She paused. It's significant, Mr. Veyron. Dante opened the folder. The authorization signatures on the transfers were Serafina's. He looked at them for a long time. He knew Serafina's signature. You cannot live with a person for 7 years and not know the way they write their own name. These were excellent. They were detailed and consistent, and they used the correct pen pressure in the correct places. They were also wrong, in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. A wrongness that lived somewhere below conscious recognition, in the part of the mind that knows things before it understands them. These are forged, he said. Strand blinked. The authentication. I know what the authentication says, they're forged. He closed the folder. Who else has seen this? Just you and me. Keep it that way. He did not tell Lucian. He was not yet sure why he made that decision, but he made it cleanly and without second-guessing himself, which was how he had learned to recognize the decisions that mattered. He called. Instead, for a private review of the shell companies, quietly, through a forensic accountant he had used once 5 years earlier for a problem he'd never discussed with anyone inside them. The accountant's name was Bellamy. He was expensive and discreet, and Dante trusted him, precisely because he had no connection to anyone Dante knew. Bellamy came back in 4 days, with a look on his face that said he had found something he was unsure he wanted to tell Dante about. The money didn't disappear, Bellamy said. He spread documents across Dante's desk in the private study. It moved, repeatedly, through entities that don't exist on paper, but very clearly exist in practice. And it ended up, he pointed at a series of account numbers. Here, these accounts are active, and they've been receiving deposits from a separate source that predates the shell company activity by about 11 years. Dante leaned forward. What separate source? Bellamy was quiet for a beat. Lucian Rook's personal holding company. The silence in the study was the kind that has weight. Show me everything, Dante said. What Bellamy showed him took the better part of 2 hours to process. The picture that emerged was not the one Dante had constructed in his head. The money siphoned through the shell companies hadn't been stolen from the family. It had been routed into a secondary pool that was being used to fund something: payments to individuals, acquisition of properties, transfers to accounts registered to people whose names Dante didn't recognize. Not theft. Infrastructure. Someone had been building something inside his organization that was parallel to the actual organization, using his family's money and Serafina's forged authorization, and the person whose fingerprints were at the origin point of the whole structure was the man who had served the Veyron family for 28 years, and who had brought Dante a glass of scotch 3 nights ago and called the evening smooth. Dante's phone buzzed. Unlisted number. He answered it anyway. You found the accounts. Serafina's voice was low and careful, the way it got when she was in a space where being overheard was possible. Where are you? Somewhere safe. That's not the conversation we need to have. I disagree with that pretty strongly. Dante. A pause. Not hesitation. She was never someone who hesitated. A deliberate pause, the kind used to make sure what comes next gets heard properly. Lucian isn't stealing your money. He's buying your loyalty. Dante pressed his thumb against the corner of his eye. That's not an explanation. It's the beginning of one. The shell companies are accounts. The accounts fund people. People are inside your organization. Captains. Soldiers. Some of your senior advisors. He's been paying them for years, not large amounts. Just enough to create obligation. Just enough that if he ever needed them to choose between you and him. Call cut. Clean and sudden, mid-sentence, as though the line had been physically severed. Dante stared at his phone for a moment, then put it face down on the desk. The door of the study opened. Maribel stood in the doorway, in a silk robe, her hair loose, her face arranged in the expression of a woman who had heard a noise and come to check on her partner. She was very good at the expression. It was nearly perfect, and perfect, Dante had long understood, was the tell. Couldn't sleep, she said. Go back to bed, he said. She looked at the documents, spread across his desk, for just a fraction of a second too long. Then she smiled and disappeared back into the dark of the hallway. Dante sat in the study until sunrise. He was thinking about the photograph, about Carver Wells, who had died in a boating accident, but who had been standing in a parking structure, handing an envelope to a younger Dante 8 months before his official death. About the night that envelope changed hands, and what had been in it, and who else had known. About a 28-year career of service that now looked, in the light of Bellamy's documents and Serafina's severed phone call, less like loyalty and more like long patience. About the message on Ortiz's windshield, and what the Queen knowing the ledger actually meant if you understood that the ledger in question wasn't Serafina's and never had been. He thought about his wife, setting her wedding ring on a white tablecloth and walking out of a room full of people who expected her to fall apart, and instead walking out like a woman who had just put the last item into a bag she'd been packing for years. He picked up his phone and called Prentice. I need you to do something for me, he said. Quietly. Off the books. Nothing goes through the usual channels. Tell me what you need, boss. I need to know everything. Maribel Cross knew about our operation before she ever walked through our front door. He heard Prentice exhale slowly on the other end. That's going to take some time. Then start now. He set the phone down and looked at the door through which Maribel had come and gone. 7 years, the marriage, the progression, every captain he'd trusted, every decision he'd made, Every moment where he had felt like he was driving, and now, in this gray early morning, with documents full of money trails and forged signatures, and a phone call severed at the exact moment it became useful, he was beginning to suspect that the steering wheel had been an illusion, and that someone else entirely had been choosing the direction. He looked at the closed door for a long time. Serafina had smiled when she walked out of that ballroom. He had told himself it was composure or defiance, or practiced dignity. He was starting to understand that it was none of those things. It was the expression of a woman who had just watched the first piece fall exactly where she'd placed it, and who was already thinking about the second. Prentice came back in 48 hours, and the look on his face when he walked into Dante's private study was the look of a man who had opened a door, expecting a closet, and found a staircase going down. He sat across from Dante without being invited to sit, which told Dante everything about the weight of what he was carrying before a single word was spoken. Prentice was not a man who forgot protocol. He was ex-military, ex-federal, the kind of person who kept his spine straight in rooms where other men slouched. And the fact that he dropped into that chair like something had gone out of his legs made Dante set down his coffee and give him his full attention. "Talk," Dante said. "Maribel Cross." Prentice put a thin folder on the desk. "Real name is Maribel Deschamps. She was born in Metairie, Louisiana. She has a younger brother named Paul, 26 years old, currently unlocatable, meaning he was locatable until about 4 months ago, and then he just stopped appearing anywhere. No hospital records, no credit activity, no phone pings." He tapped the folder. "She's not a random woman, boss. She was managed. Someone built her cover. The apartment she was living in when you first met her, the lease was paid through a property management company that traces back to a holding company that I cannot fully unwrap, but that shares a registered agent with. 2 of the shell entities in your own financials." Dante didn't move. "She was placed. Everything points that direction. By Lucian." Prentice opened his mouth and then closed it again. He pressed his hands flat on the desk. "By someone with access to your financial infrastructure and enough time to set up the placement carefully. Lucian is the most obvious answer. But I want to be careful about how certain we sound before we have hard confirmation. Because if we're wrong about who's running this and we move on Lucian, I know what happens if we move wrong." Dante picked up the folder and looked at the first page. Photograph of Maribel at what appeared to be a charity event, smiling, standing beside a man Dante didn't recognize. "Who's the man beside her?" Prentice hesitated. "We're working on that. Work faster." Dante set the folder down. "She's still in this building. I know. She doesn't know we know. I know that too. Keep it that way. I want her watched. Everything she touches, every call she makes, every room she enters when she thinks she's alone. Nothing happens to her. She is not touched. But I want to know everything." Prentice nodded and left. Dante sat for a long time looking at the photograph of Maribel laughing at a charity event beside a man whose face Prentice hadn't been able to place. Her laugh in the photograph looked real. He wondered how much of what she'd shown him had been real, and how much had been constructed, and he realized with a slow nauseating clarity that he could not trust his own read of her because he had not been reading her. He had been looking at what he wanted to look at, which was a different thing entirely. He had been doing that for a long time, apparently. He went upstairs. Maribel was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a mug of tea, scrolling through something on her phone. She looked up when he came in and gave him the warm, careful smile she had been giving him for months, and he returned it with the approximation of his own. And they stood in that kitchen, performing a version of domesticity that was built entirely out of lies. And he thought about Serafina, who had never pretended to be anything other than exactly what she was, even when what she was made him uncomfortable. "You look tired," Maribel said. "Long night. Come to bed." In a while, he poured himself water he didn't want and leaned against the counter. "I've been thinking about the organization, about the transition." He watched her face. "There are people I need to move around. Consolidate some responsibilities. Lucian's been suggesting some restructuring." Something passed through Maribel's eyes. Fast and small, but there. "Lucian seems like a smart man." "He is." Dante drank the water. "What do you think of him?" She tilted her head. "I barely know him. You've had dinner with him 4 times. The pause was a fraction of a second too long. I didn't realize you were counting. I noticed things. He set the glass down. Go to bed. I'll be up. She held his gaze for a moment, searching for something, he thought. Some indication of how much he knew, or how much was performance. And then she nodded and took her tea and left the kitchen. Dante waited until he heard the bedroom door close. Then he took out his phone and sent a single message to Bellamy. Find me the registered agent. All of them. I need the human being, not the company name. 3 floors below, in the building's security hub, Prentice watched Maribel's phone light up with an incoming text the moment she reached the bedroom. The number was masked. She read it and didn't respond. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the phone in both hands. And for a moment, just a moment, her face did something that Prentice had not expected. It crumpled. Just briefly, around the eyes and mouth, the expression of a person carrying something much heavier than they signed up for. Then she straightened her spine and put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Prentice noted the time in his log. He did not know what to make of what he'd seen, and he was not in the business of interpretation, but he noted it because his instincts told him it mattered. On the 4th day after Serafina's disappearance, Lucian appeared in Dante's office without an appointment, which was unusual enough to qualify as a message. He closed the door behind him and sat in the chair across from Dante's desk and crossed his legs and looked like a man who had decided to get ahead of something. She's been in contact with you, Lucian said. Dante looked at him. Who has? Don't do that. It wastes both of our time. Lucian smoothed his tie. Called you. I know she called you, because she's tried to reach 3 other people in this organization in the last 72 hours, and 2 of those people have come to me. He paused. Because they're loyal. And the 3rd? That's a separate conversation. Lucian's voice stayed even. What did she tell you? Dante leaned back in his chair. He was watching Lucian the way he had been watching everything for the past 4 days differently. With the particular attention you give to something, once you understand, it might be dangerous. Lucian's hands were still. His jaw was relaxed. He was performing calm confidence, and he was performing it well. But Dante noticed, for the first time, that Lucian never fully blinked at a normal rate. His eyes stayed open slightly too long between blinks, which was either a personal habit Dante had simply never registered, or the subtle ocular pattern of a man maintaining a fixed expression under stress. She told me you were stealing from the family, Dante said. Lucian didn't blink at all for a moment. Did she? Those were her words. And what did you find when you looked? I'm still looking. Lucian nodded slowly, like a man receiving information he had expected. Dante, I have served this family since before you took over from your father. I was there when your father built this organization. I was there when he died. He let that sit for a moment. Serafina came into this family 7 years ago. I told your father, before his death, that I had concerns about her background. He didn't listen. You didn't listen. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. She has been working against you from the inside. Counts. The shell companies she built those. I've been trying to document it carefully enough to bring to you without might. Show me. Lucian paused. What? Show me the documentation. Whatever you've built. Whatever you have on her. Put it on this desk. Pause stretched. It was brief. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But between 2 men who had sat across from each other. For years it was an eternity. Lucian recovered smoothly and reached into his jacket and produced a folded document that he laid on the desk with the practiced ease of a man who had prepared for exactly this moment. Dante unfolded it. Financial records, authorization signatures, a printed summary of transactions. He looked at it carefully. Then he looked up at Lucian. These are the same documents I already have, Dante said, because they're the same evidence, the same documents, identical formatting, same print date. He set them down. How do you have documents with my print date on them, Lucian? The silence in the room changed quality. Something that had been careful and calibrated shifted into something else, something with more edges. Lucian's expression didn't collapse. That was what Dante found most disturbing. The man was 62 years old, and he had clearly been in rooms like this before, and he did not collapse under pressure. He simply adjusted. I have sources in your document management system. That's not something I'm proud of, but given the nature of what Serafina, you have sources in my document management system, Dante repeated. For your protection, You've been monitoring my internal documents. Dante's voice was very quiet. For my protection. Yes. Get out of my office, Lucian. Something moved across Lucian's face. Not fear, he was past fear in this situation, Dante thought. Or perhaps fear had been replaced by something more complicated. Calculation. The recalibration of a man who had taken a position and found it less stable than he thought, and was now deciding whether to hold it or retreat. He stood. He straightened his jacket with the automatic dignity of a man who had spent decades being the most composed person in any given room. Be careful, Lucian said. It was not a warning delivered with heat. It was delivered with the flat affect of a statement of fact. She's been building this for years. She's very good at making the wrong person look guilty. He moved to the door. That's what she's doing to me right now. He left. Dante sat without moving for a full minute, and then he stood and went to the window and looked out at the city and thought about his father. His father's death had been ruled a stroke sudden, clean, unremarkable in the medical record. Dante had grieved it and moved through the succession and never questioned the cause because there had been no reason to question it because his father was 67 years old and had lived a life that was not gentle on the body. He was questioning it now. He was questioning it in the way that you question something once a door has been opened, that you cannot close again once you understand that the story you have been told about your own life might have been written by someone else. He called Bellamy. The holding company, Dante said. The one that shares the registered agent with the shell entities. What did you find? I found the human being, Bellamy said. His voice was careful. The registered agent is a law firm in Delaware. The attorney of record who set up the entity 12 years ago is currently semi-retired. I spoke to him this morning. He says he was hired to set up the structure by a referral. Another attorney introduced the client. Who was the client? Silence on the line. Bellamy. Client was listed as the Veyron Family Trust, Bellamy said. The signatory on the formation documents is a name I think you'll recognize. Victor Rook. Victor Rook. Lucian's brother, dead 11 years, who had served as the Veyron family's financial administrator for a decade before his death, and who had built the accounting systems that Strand still use today. Dante had attended Victor's funeral. He had given the eulogy. He ended the call and stood at the window and let the information rearrange itself inside his skull. Lucian had not built this in response to Serafina. Lucian had been building this before Serafina existed in Dante's life. The infrastructure, the shell companies, the parallel financial system, the network of obligations purchased with small regular payments had been assembled by Victor Rook 12 years ago, and then inherited and expanded by Lucian after his brother's death. This was not a reaction. This was original architecture, which meant Serafina had not walked into a stable empire and begun undermining it. She had walked into an empire that was already compromised and had spent 7 years figuring out by whom and how deeply. His phone buzzed. Prentice. You need to come to the security hub, Prentice said. Now. Don't use the elevator. Dante took the stairs. Prentice was waiting in the narrow corridor outside the hub with his jacket open and his hand resting near his holster, which was not a casual posture. What happened? Dante said. Maribel made a call 40 minutes ago. The masking was better than the previous ones, but we got enough of the routing to narrow the destination. Prentice handed Dante a printout. It went to a relay that we've seen before. It's the same relay that was used to send the text she received the night of your dinner, with Strand. Dante looked at the printout, and 20 minutes after her call, one of your captains, Breck, who runs the eastern warehouses, left his post without logging out or notifying his second. His car was found 40 minutes ago in the parking structure on Meridian. Empty. No signs of struggle. He's just gone. Breck was one of the 3 people Serafina tried to contact, Dante said. Yes. She said 2 of them came to Lucian. Dante looked at Prentice. Breck was the 3rd. That's what I'm thinking. Dante put his hand against the corridor wall and pressed his palm flat and breathed. Breck was not a man who disappeared easily. He was careful and experienced and had been navigating dangerous situations for 15 years. If he was gone without a trace, it was because someone with significant resources and advance information had moved on him quickly, and the timing 40 minutes after Maribel's call was not a coincidence. It was a sequence. She called someone. And 30 minutes later, a man who had spoken to my wife is missing, Dante said. Yes. That's not an affair. That's not pillow talk. That's operational. Yes. Dante straightened. The decision forming in his chest was one he could feel before he could articulate it. The way certain decisions arrive not as thoughts but as physical certainties. I need to talk to her. Tonight. And I need it to happen somewhere that isn't this building. Prentice looked at him. If she knows, we know. She's going to know soon regardless. Lucian is already moving. Breck is proof of that. If she's working for Lucian, and Lucian is accelerating, then sitting on what we have and waiting is going to cost us more people. He turned and started back toward the stairs. Set it up, something that looks normal. Dinner out, just the two of us. Somewhere public enough that she feels safe, and private enough that we can talk. And if she runs? She won't run, Dante said. She doesn't want to run. That's the thing, Prentice. She never wanted any of this. I can see it on her when she thinks I'm not watching. He paused on the stairs. Whatever Lucian has over her, it's enough to keep her in place. Which means she's more afraid of him than she is of me. He went back upstairs and found Maribel in the living room with a book open in her lap that she clearly had not been reading. She looked up with the warm, careful smile, and he matched it and told her he'd made a reservation for that evening. Somewhere quiet. He needed to decompress. Would she come? She said yes without hesitation, which meant she was either genuinely willing or had already been told to say yes, and at this point the distinction barely mattered. That afternoon, Dante received a message through a channel he had set up himself and told nobody about a secure email address that existed solely for communication with Bellamy and one other person, a contact inside the federal prosecutor's office named Winters, whom he had cultivated for years as a form of insurance. The message was not from Bellamy or Winters. It was from an address he didn't recognize, a string of random characters that had been used exactly once. The message contained 4 words and a file attachment. Open it, then decide. He opened the attachment. It was a video file, 12 minutes long, filmed on what appeared to be a security camera positioned somewhere inside a building he didn't immediately recognize. The image quality was good, better than standard security footage, which meant the camera was concealed and high grade. The footage showed a room, a conference table, 3 men sitting around it, and a 4th standing. The 3 sitting were men Dante knew, 2 senior family elders, and a captain named Pharaoh, who had been with the organization for over a decade. The man standing had his back to the camera for the first 4 minutes of the footage. Then he turned around. Lucian. Dante watched 12 minutes of footage in which Lucian Rook, in a room with 2 family elders and a captain, discussed the timeline for what he called the transition of authority. The language was careful. Lucian was always careful, but the meaning was not ambiguous. He was discussing the removal of Dante Veyron from operational control of the family. He referenced Maribel by name as an asset. He referenced the manufactured financial evidence. And at the 10-minute mark, one of the elders asked about Serafina, and Lucian said 3 words that Dante had to replay twice to be certain he had heard correctly. She found the ledger. And then, which is why we moved up the timeline. Dante sat with the laptop open, and the video paused on Lucian's face, silver-haired, composed, addressing a room of conspirators with the same even authority he had brought to every family meeting Dante had ever attended, and understood that the timeline had already moved, that the action Lucian had taken against Breck was not a warning or a precaution. It was the beginning of something that was already in progress. He picked up his phone to call Prentice. The building's security system went offline before the call connected. Security system came back online in 40 seconds. Dante knew because he counted standing in the middle of his study with his phone dead in his hand and the laptop still open on Lucian's frozen face. He counted the seconds the way a person counts when every other cognitive function has been temporarily suspended by the pure animal recognition that something has just shifted from bad to worse. 40 seconds of darkness in the building's nervous system, long enough to send a message, short enough to deny it was intentional. Prentice came through the door at a run 30 seconds after the lights returned. That was them, Dante said before Prentice could speak. We don't know. It was them. It was a demonstration. He turned the laptop toward Prentice. Watch the last 2 minutes of this. Prentice watched. His jaw tightened at the 10-minute mark. He didn't say anything until the footage ended, and then he said, "Where did this come from?" Anonymous. Sent to a private channel nobody should have known existed. Prentice looked at him. "Serafina, that's my read." Dante closed the laptop, which means she's not hiding. She's feeding me information from somewhere, and she's been close enough to that room to plant a camera, which means she's been inside Lucian's circle at a level I did not understand. He moved to the door. The dinner with Maribel is still happening. Tonight, nothing changes on her end, but I need you to pull every man we have that is not on Bellamy's list. Bellamy's list. The accounts. The people receiving payments from Lucian's infrastructure. Anyone whose name appears on that list is compromised. Pull them from anything sensitive, and do it quietly enough that they don't know they've been pulled. Dante put his hand on the doorframe. How many loyal men do we actually have in this building right now? Prentice. Honest count. Prentice didn't answer immediately. That pause was its own kind of answer. 11 that I'd stake my life on. Maybe 6 more that I'm reasonably confident about. 17 men in a building that runs 43. The list is accurate, yes. Dante absorbed that. 26 people in his own headquarters who might, for sufficient pressure, choose the man who had been paying them small amounts of money for years over the man who signed their paychecks. The mathematics of loyalty, reduced to a number he could hold in his hand, was 17. Tonight, Dante said, we moved tonight. Maribel dressed for dinner with the careful attention of a woman who understood that appearances were a form of armor. Dante watched her from the doorway of the bedroom for a moment. Before she saw him, she was standing at the mirror in a dark green dress, applying lipstick with a steady hand, and her face in the reflection was not the face she showed him. It was older, tearer, the face of someone carrying a weight that predated anything between the two of them by a considerable distance. When she caught his eye in the mirror, she reassembled the warmth immediately. But he'd seen what was underneath it, and he stored it carefully. The restaurant was 12 blocks from the penthouse. Dante had chosen it because he'd used it before for conversations that needed witnesses without listeners. The ambient noise was sufficient, the tables well-spaced, and the owner owed him a favor that had never been called in. Prentice rode separately and stationed himself at the bar. 2 of the 17 dependable men covered the exits. They ordered. Maribel talked about the food. She talked about a film she'd been meaning to watch. She was good at the surface, genuinely good. Not awkward good. The kind of good that came from practice or natural talent. And Dante found himself, even now, understanding why he had been drawn to her. She was warm and present and seemed, moment to moment, to actually be in the room with you in a way that some people simply were not. He waited until the entrees arrived, and then he set down his fork and looked at her directly. "Tell me about your brother," he said. The fork in her hand didn't drop. Her hand didn't shake. But something happened behind her eyes that was fast and deep, like a stone dropping into water, the ripple visible, even though the stone had already sunk. She set her own fork down with a precision that suggested she needed a moment to trust her hands. "Paul," she said, "yes." "How do you know about Paul?" "I know a lot of things I didn't know a week ago." He kept his voice level and his hands loose on the table. "I'm not asking to threaten you. I want you to understand that before you decide what to say next. I'm asking because I think you have been in an impossible situation, and I think you have been in it for a long time, and I think the person who put you there is the same person I am trying to understand." She looked at him for a long time. The restaurant moved around them, silverware, low conversation, a waiter crossing the room with plates. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying, holding it back with the particular discipline of someone who has had a lot of practice deciding when they are allowed to feel things. "He took Paul 4 months ago," she said. Her voice was barely above conversational volume. "Not publicly, not violently. Paul just didn't come home one evening, and the next morning I received a phone call that told me he was safe and would stay safe as long as I did exactly what I was told." She exhaled slowly. "By then I had already met you. She stopped. "Already what?" "Already started to feel something that wasn't part of the arrangement." She said it flatly, not as a bid for sympathy. Just as a fact, she had decided to stop carrying alone, which made everything harder. Dante was quiet for a moment. "What were you supposed to do?" "Get close. Get inside. Get you to trust me enough That when the transition happened, you would look to me for support, and I would redirect you away from anyone who might help you see clearly. She pressed her fingers against the table's surface. I wasn't supposed to know what the full plan was. I was compartmentalized. I knew my piece. But you figured out more than your piece. Figured out enough to be scared. Her jaw tightened. The man who calls me, he doesn't tell me his name, but I know his voice now, and I've heard it once before 2 years ago at a family event I attended with you. He was standing near the fireplace in the East Salon, talking to one of the elder advisors, and I remember his voice because it was the kind of voice that sounds generous and means nothing generous by it. She paused, silver-haired, very still when he stands. Lucian Rook, Dante said. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted, a loosening, like a knot releasing. I wasn't certain enough to say it out loud. I am. Dante picked up his fork again, because the appearance of normalcy in a public space was still worth maintaining. Pregnancy. Maribel's hand moved to her stomach, and then stopped deliberately. Also part of the plan. I was instructed to tell you regardless of the reality. She looked at the table. There is no pregnancy, Dante. He absorbed that. He was not surprised. He had been assembling the shape of this for days, and the pregnancy had been the piece that felt most like a lever, too well timed, too convenient, too neatly placed in the narrative to be anything other than a mechanism. But hearing it said directly produced a different response than reasoning it out intellectually. His chest tightened, not because he had wanted the child, he hadn't had time to want anything about it yet, but because of what it said about the level of calculation involved. Someone had been willing to use the idea of a child as a tool. That required a particular kind of cold. When Lucian calls you, Dante said, what does he use? Channel. A phone he provided. It's in my bag. She didn't move toward the bag. I assume you've been monitoring it. The mask number, yes. Not the content. He calls every 2 to 3 days. He asks for status updates. He tells me what to do or say next. She looked up. 2 nights ago, he told me that the timeline had moved. He didn't explain why, but he was different, less patient. There was something under the way he was talking that I hadn't heard before. Urgency, Dante said. Fear, she corrected. Lucian Rook was afraid. Dante thought about the video. She found the ledger. The timeline had moved because Serafina had found something, or Lucian believed she had. And whatever that something was, it was significant enough to make a man who had spent 12 years in careful patient construction suddenly start moving fast. Fast was dangerous. Fast meant errors. It also meant that whatever Lucian was afraid of losing might be lost very shortly, which meant he would act before he was ready rather than wait and act correctly. I need you to keep answering his calls, Dante said. Maribel looked at him with something between relief and wariness. I'm not doing anything to you. Your brother is going to be found. I have people working on that already, and I am going to accelerate it starting tonight. He met her eyes. In exchange, I need you to keep performing. Keep answering. Don't change anything in how you respond to him. Can you do that? For how long? Not long. She nodded once. They finished dinner in a silence that was not comfortable, but was at least honest, which Dante had come to understand was rarer and more valuable than comfort. On the ride back to the penthouse, his phone rang. Prentice, from the trail car behind them. We have a location, Prentice said. Serafina. She made contact through the Bellamy channel 20 minutes ago. She wants a meeting. Tonight. She says she has something you need to see in person, and it cannot be transmitted electronically. Dante looked out the window at the city moving past. Where? The Atlantic Commerce Building. Parking structure. Level 3, a pause. Same location as the photograph. Choice of location was deliberate. She was telling him something with it, that she knew about the photograph, that she had either placed it or knew who had, and that she was choosing a location that carried weight, specifically to remind him of the night with Carver Wells, and everything that night implied about who had been making decisions in his life and for how long. He told the driver to change direction. The parking structure at the Atlantic Commerce Building was exactly as he remembered it. Low ceilings, amber lighting, the smell of concrete and exhaust. Level 3 was mostly empty at this hour. Prentice came with him, the two of them, moving through the structure in silence, and Dante found himself thinking about the last time he had stood in this building's parking structure, younger and less careful, and handing his trust to a man who was supposed to be dead. Serafina was standing beside a concrete pillar near the far wall. She was dressed in clothes that suggested she had not been stationary, dark layers, flat shoes, hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone not concerned with appearance. The leather case was beside her on the ground. She looked like she had not slept well in days, which was the first genuinely unguarded thing he had seen from her in a very long time. She looked at him. She looked at Prentice. "Just you," she said to Dante. "Prentice stays in earshot," Dante said. She considered it and nodded. Prentice moved back 20 feet and turned to watch the entrance. Dante walked to Serafina and stopped 6 feet away, which felt like the correct distance for two people who had shared a bed for 7 years and had arrived at this parking structure from opposite sides of a conspiracy. "The video," he said. "That was you. I've had a camera in that room for 11 months. How did you get access to that room?" Lucian trusts certain people because they've been in his infrastructure long enough that he stopped checking their loyalty. Victor built the original network. Some of Victor's people didn't know they'd been transferred to Lucian's management after Victor died. Few of them were willing to listen to a different conversation when it was offered carefully enough. She crossed her arms. Not defensively, she was cold. The structure was unheated. "I've been building this for 3 years, and you didn't tell me." Her expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. "Would you have listened?" He didn't answer, because the honest answer was no, and they both knew it, and saying it out loud served no purpose. "What do you have in the case?" "The original financial ledgers. Victor's the ones predating the shell company structure, showing the initial architecture. Correspondence between Lucian and both Elders Hargrove and Steen going back 9 years. Photographs. And a recording." She picked up the case and held it by the handle. "The recording is Lucian, 11 months ago, discussing your father." Dante went very still. "What about my father?" he said. His voice came out flat, in a way that had nothing to do with control, and everything to do with the fact that some reactions are too large to color. Serafina looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite apology, but lived in the territory between them. "Your father's death was not a stroke," she said. "The recording is a conversation between Lucian and Hargrove, in which Lucian discusses the timing and the method, and his satisfaction with how cleanly it had been handled. The amber light of the parking structure was unchanged. The city outside made its continuous noise. Prentice stood 20 feet away, looking at the entrance. Everything around Dante was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago, and he was experiencing it from behind a wall of glass that had materialized somewhere inside his rib cage, through which the world was still visible, but no longer quite reachable. "Killed my father," Dante said. "He arranged it. He used a physician who has since relocated to another country." She held his gaze. "Session, everything that followed your father's death, the struggle, the period where you were most vulnerable, it was engineered to need to rely heavily on the advisor who was already in place. It was designed to make Lucian indispensable. He's been running the family," Dante said. "Been running you. There's a difference." Her voice wasn't cruel when she said it. Precise. "You made real decisions. You have real authority. He just ensured that the information reaching you, the options presented to you, and the people surrounding you were all filtered through his management. You were the face and the force of this organization. He was the architecture underneath it." Dante turned away from her, put his hand on the concrete pillar, and looked at the raw surface of it, gray and rough and utterly indifferent, and breathed through what was moving through his chest. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about the eulogy he had delivered. He was thinking about 28 years of quiet, efficient service, and dinners and scotch at the end of evenings, and the way Lucian had always known the right thing to say, always known which argument would land, always seemed to understand Dante's thinking just slightly ahead of the moment Dante had articulated it. Of course he had. He had been shaping the thinking. "The night of the ballroom," Dante said, his back still to Serafina. "That was Lucian. He suggested it to you 6 weeks ago. The idea of the public declaration. He framed it as a consolidation of authority, a demonstration of decisiveness." She paused. "You thought you were making a choice. He knew I would do it. He knew exactly which version of your pride to activate." She said it without contempt. as a piece of mechanics. He also knew what it would do to your relationship with me, which was the actual goal. He needed you isolated from the one person who had been quietly documenting everything he'd built. Dante turned back around. Why didn't you come to me earlier? 3 years ago. 2 years ago. Before the ballroom. She looked at him with eyes that had the specific exhaustion of someone who has answered this question many times in their own head. Because I needed the full picture before I moved. Because moving early, with incomplete evidence, against a man who had been building infrastructure for 12 years inside your organization, would have given him enough warning to bury everything and reposition. And because she stopped. Because I was not certain you would believe me over him, she said it quietly. That's the truth. I did not trust that your faith in Lucien wasn't stronger than whatever you felt for me. So I built the case until it was undeniable. A pause. And then you chose Maribel in front of everyone, and I had to make a decision about whether to fold or accelerate. You accelerated, I accelerated. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. 7 years of marriage collapsed to its essential components in the amber light of a parking structure. At 11 at night, 2 people stripped of everything except what they actually were, turned out to be considerably more complicated and considerably less romantic than either of them would have chosen. I need the recording, he said. You can have everything in this case. That's why I called the meeting. She held it out toward him. But I need something from you first. Name it, Maribel's brother. Paul Deschamps. He's being held at a property in the industrial district, near the port. I have the address. Before anything else happens, before any move against Lucien, I need you to extract that boy. Her jaw was set. He's 26 years old, and he has been in a room for 4 months, because his sister was useful to Lucien. He had nothing to do with any of this. I'll have Prentice. Now tonight. Before we go back. Dante looked at her. You've known where he was. I've known for 3 weeks. I was waiting until I had you in a room where Lucien couldn't hear the conversation. She kept holding the case toward him. Get him out, Dante. Then we move. He took the case. He turned and raised his voice just enough. Prentice. Prentice crossed the distance between them in a few strides. Dante gave him the address and the name, and watched his head of security step away and begin making calls with the quiet efficiency of a man who was very good at his work. Then Dante turned back to Serafina, and they stood in silence for a moment that had a different quality than the silences, before it not comfortable, but no longer full of things unsaid. There's something else, Serafina said. He had known there was something else. People who hold the pause the way she was holding it always have something else. Photograph, she said. The one I left in the penthouse. Carver Wells, I remember. Carver Wells is not dead. She watched his face. He relocated. He has been living under a different name in a different country for 14 years. And he has been paying Lucien a quarterly amount that appears in none of the ledgers I've found, which means there is a level of this that I have not been able to fully document. She was very still. Carver Wells was your father's silent partner before your father built the organization into what it became. And the reason the Veyron family succeeded the way it did in the first 15 years, the protection, the access, the extraordinary good fortune in certain federal and municipal dealings is that Carver Wells had connections inside the government that he exchanged for a percentage of everything the family earned. Dante was very quiet for a moment. My father knew. Your father built the arrangement, and when my father died, the arrangement transferred to you, technically, except that the man managing the arrangement on the family side was Lucien. So the arrangement effectively transferred to Lucien, who has been collecting and paying and managing that relationship for 11 years without your knowledge. She paused. You have been the face of an organization that has been protected and partially controlled by a government-connected figure for over 2 decades, and you did not know that figure existed. Concrete pillar was still there. Dante put his hand on it again. He needed something solid and indifferent, and the pillar qualified. Thought about the photograph. He had assumed it was a threat look, what we know about you. He understood now that it was a map. This is where the roots of this thing go. This is how deep. If Lucien is exposed, Dante said slowly, Wells is exposed. And Wells has government connections, which is why Lucien has operated with such confidence for so long, Serafina said. He believed no one would move against him, because moving against him risked exposing a relationship that would damage people with considerable power to retaliate. She looked at him steadily. He was right as a general principle. The question is whether the evidence we have is comprehensive enough and delivered through the right channels to make retaliation impossible. What channels? I've been in contact with a federal investigator for 7 months. Someone outside the connections Wells has. A prosecutor's office in a different district that has no relationship to any of the entities in the ledgers. She watched his face. I know you have your own contact inside the federal system. Winters. Dante said nothing for a moment. The knowledge that she knew about Winters, a contact he had cultivated carefully and quietly, over years landed somewhere between impressed and chilling. How long have you known about Winters? 4 years. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. I've had my own conversation with him. Independently. He doesn't know we're connected. You've been building parallel tracks, Dante said. I've been building redundancy, she corrected, in case one track got cut. She looked at him with the direct clarity of someone who has been operating alone for a very long time and is only now, carefully, beginning to allow someone else into the room. Lucian is going to move in the next 24 to 48 hours. Timeline accelerated because he knows I've been collecting. He doesn't know how much I have, but he knows enough to be afraid. Which means tonight is the last night. We have to set the pieces before he does. Prentice reappeared. Teams moving on the industrial address. 30 minutes in and out. Dante nodded. He looked back at Serafina. There was a great deal more to say, and none of it could be said in this parking structure on this timeline. He was aware of the weight of the case in his hand and the weight of everything inside it. 12 years of architecture, his father's death, the government connection, courting, and the awareness that none of it mattered if Lucian moved first and moved fast enough to destroy what they were holding before it could be delivered. Where are you staying? He said. Somewhere Lucian doesn't know about. I need to be able to reach you. You can reach me through the same channel you used to receive the video. She picked up nothing. She had nothing with her except what she was wearing. Go back to the penthouse. Behave normally. Keep Maribel in place. And Dante, she said his name the way she had said it in the early years of their marriage, before things calcified, and it landed differently because of that. Don't trust anyone in that building that isn't on Prentice's list. Not for the next 24 hours. Not for anything. He started to turn away, and then stopped. Why did you smile? He said. That night, when you walked out, she considered the question. Because I had spent 3 years waiting for the moment when Lucian overplayed his hand. She said, and the ballroom was that moment. He pushed you into a public humiliation of your own wife because he needed to separate us, and he needed to do it in a way that felt like your choice. And it worked, it did what he needed it to do. But it was also the moment he stopped being careful. She met his eyes. Patient men are dangerous. Impatient men make mistakes. I smiled because he had finally stopped being patient. Dante left her standing in the amber light of level 3 and walked back toward the exit with the leather case in his hand and the full weight of what he now knew settling into his body like something he would have to learn to carry. He was halfway back to the penthouse when his phone rang. Unknown number, different from any he recognized. He answered it. The voice on the other end was older, unhurried. The voice of a man accustomed to being the calmest person in whatever conversation he was having. Mr. Veyron, the voice said, my name is Carver Wells. I think it's time we spoke directly. A pause, measured and deliberate, because Lucian has just made a decision that is very bad for both of us. And I believe we may have a narrow window in which to do something about it before he takes the one thing that can stop him. Dante tightened his hand on the phone. Tell me, he said. And Carver Wells began to speak, and with every sentence, the shape of the thing Dante was inside became larger and older and more deeply rooted than anything he had yet imagined, until he was standing on a street corner in the city where he had built his empire and feeling, for the first time in his adult life, like a man who had been living in someone else's house. Carver Wells talked for 11 minutes. Dante stood on the street corner and listened without interrupting, which was not his natural inclination, but which the content of what Wells was saying made necessary, because interrupting would have required him to stop processing, and processing was the only thing keeping him functional. Wells spoke in the measured cadences of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his head many times, and had finally been given the occasion to deliver it. He was 71 years old, by his own account. He had been living under the name Edward Caro in a country he declined to name. He had been watching, from a considerable distance, as Lucian Rook systematically dismantled the arrangement that Wells and the elder Veyron had built together over 20 years. Piece Serafina had not known the pieces that made Dante's hand tighten on the phone until his knuckles ached. Was this Lucian had not merely been managing the Wells arrangement on the family's behalf. For the past 4 years, Lucian had been rerouting Wells's payments to a separate account and replacing them with smaller amounts drawn from the family's own operating funds. Wells believed he was receiving his full percentage from the Veyron organization. He was not. He was receiving a fraction of it, with the difference going to Lucian's personal infrastructure, and he had not discovered the discrepancy until 3 weeks ago when a contact inside his financial management team noticed irregularities in the incoming transfer structure. Lucian had been stealing from a man who had government connections and a very long memory. That was the mistake. That was why he was afraid. Not Serafina's evidence alone. Serafina's evidence was dangerous, but containable, potentially, with enough aggressive maneuvering. Carver Wells with a grievance was a different category of problem entirely. He's going to move against your organization tonight, Wells said, toward the end of the 11 minutes. Not tomorrow. Not in 48 hours. Tonight. I have a source inside his immediate circle, and the source tells me the order has already gone out. He's bringing in outside contractors, people with no connection to your family who he can cut loose afterward. His plan is to take the evidence your wife has collected, take control of your organization's senior structure, and present the remaining captains with a choice between him and chaos. A pause. He believes you do not have the evidence yet. He doesn't know about tonight's meeting. How long? Dante said. My source says they move at 2 in the morning. You have roughly 3 hours. Dante looked at his watch. 11:14. He thanked Wells in 2 words and ended the call and turned to Prentice, who had been standing 4 feet away, reading his face throughout the entire conversation. Change of timeline, Dante said. Lucian moves at 2. We have 3 hours to set everything we have. He was already walking. Call Bellamy. Tell him to transmit everything to both federal contacts simultaneously. Winters and Serafina's contact, whoever that is. Get me a name and number for her contact before we reach the penthouse. He was moving fast enough that Prentice had to lengthen his stride to match. And Paul Deschamps, where is the extraction team? 20 minutes out from the address. Tell them to accelerate. I want that boy in a safe location, and I want Maribel confirmed on that, before anything else happens tonight. He pulled out his phone and opened the secure channel. I'm going to try to reach Serafina. The message he sent was 5 words. 2 a.m. Wells confirmed. Move now. The response came in under a minute, which meant she was watching the channel actively. Already moving. Meet at the building. 11:50. Not the penthouse. Not a neutral location. The building, the headquarters, the place Prentice had said, might have 26 compromised people inside it at any given moment. Dante stared at the response for a second and then understood. She wasn't asking him to meet her somewhere safe. She was telling him the confrontation was going to happen on home ground, which meant she had a reason to want it there, which meant she knew something about the building's configuration, or the evidence transmission that required the specific location. He trusted that she had a reason that was new. 3 weeks ago, he would not have trusted it. He was operating on something that wasn't quite restored faith, but was adjacent to it, the practical recognition that she had been correct about every single thing so far. That her judgment under pressure was considerably better than his own. Car ride back took 9 minutes. In those 9 minutes, Dante called Strand and told her in careful language to prepare for a financial emergency authorization process that might be initiated within the hour, without asking questions. He called the 2 most senior captains on Prentice's confirmed list and told them to be inside the building, armed and ready for instruction by 11:45. He did not tell them why. Then he went upstairs to the penthouse. Then he went upstairs at the penthouse and found Maribel sitting on the sofa with her phone in her lap and her shoulders pulled in, which was the posture of someone waiting for news about someone they loved. Prentice's team found him, Dante said from the doorway. She stood up so fast, she nearly knocked the phone off the cushion. Paul, he's safe. They're moving him to a secure location right now. You'll be able to speak to him within the hour. He crossed the room. I need you to listen to me carefully. Lucien is going to move tonight. When he does, this building is going to become a complicated place to be. I need you on the floor below this one, in the secure room, with 2 of my men outside the door. Not because you're a prisoner, because that room has reinforced walls and its own power supply. And I cannot manage what's coming tonight if I'm also managing your safety. She looked at him. Her eyes were red at the edges. What about you? I'll be in the building. That's not an answer. The only one I have right now. He held her gaze. You did the right thing tonight. At dinner. I know what that cost you, and I know you were afraid, and I know you did it anyway. He moved toward the door. Cure room. 2 of my men. 1 hour. He left her standing in the center of the penthouse and went downstairs. Serafina arrived at 11:47 through a service entrance that Dante had not known she knew about, and that Prentice, watching the camera feed, pulled up with an expression of grudging respect. She was carrying the leather case and a second bag that she hadn't had in the parking structure, and she was moving with the specific urgency of someone who had been in motion for hours and had decided that stopping was not an option. Came to the main operations room on the 3rd floor, where Dante, Prentice, and 4 of the confirmed loyal men were standing around a table covered with documents and open laptops. She took in the room in one sweep, assessed Prentice with a single look that he returned with a nod, and set the leather case on the table. The transmission to the federal contacts, she said. Has it gone? Bellamy is transmitting now, Dante said. Both channels simultaneously. Good. Because once Lucien realizes what's been sent, he will try to move the evidence and move the people. The transmissions make that impossible. Anything he does after federal receipt becomes obstruction. She opened the second bag and took out a laptop. I have a contact inside Lucien's household staff. She placed a secondary device in his home office 6 weeks ago. It's audio only, but it's live. She opened the laptop and a waveform appeared on the screen, a live audio's a feed. Low background noise, the sound of a room. He's been in that office for the past 2 hours. He's been making calls. One of the men at the table leaned forward. Can we hear? Serafina adjusted the volume. Lucien's voice filled the operations room. Mid-sentence, speaking to someone with the clipped authority of a man directing a complex operation, not the top floors. The server room and the evidence archive. Those are the priorities. Everything else is secondary. A pause. I don't care about Dante. Dante can be managed after. What I cannot manage is the documentation leaving this city. Dante stood very still and listened to the voice of the man who had killed his father discuss the management of the building they were currently standing in. He's sending them for the archive, Prentice said. He doesn't know we've already transmitted, Serafina said. She looked at Dante. But the physical originals in this building are still valuable. If he destroys them before the federal contact can confirm receipt and preservation, there's a window of vulnerability. The originals are in the case, Dante said. Some of them. The rest are in your evidence archive on sublevel 2. I need someone to move them in the next. She checked her watch. 40 minutes. Prentice was already pointing at 2 men. They moved without words. The next 40 minutes were the kind of organized chaos that looks from the outside, like calm. People moving through corridors, equipment being relocated, calls being made in low-controlled voices. Dante moved through his own building with the specific alertness of someone operating in a space that is no longer fully safe, checking angles, reading the body language of every person he passed, filing away the ones whose eyes moved differently or whose hands stayed too still. At 12:41, the building's perimeter alarm registered a vehicle approaching from the North Service Road. Prentice pulled up the camera feed. 2 vehicles, dark, moving without headlights. Not subtle. Lucien wasn't attempting subtlety. This wasn't a covert operation. It was a show of force, designed to overwhelm rather than deceive. 6 men in the first vehicle, Prentice said, watching the feed. Can't get a count on the second. How many confirmed on our side in this building right now? Dante said. 14. 2 are with the archive. 12 against an unknown number of contractors. Dante looked at the feed. He's coming in through the North Service entrance. That puts him at the sub-level access corridor first, which is where the archive is, which is where Prentice's men are. Dante turned. Can we lock the sub-level corridor remotely? Yes, but if the security system has been accessed. The system was offline for 40 seconds 3 nights ago, Serafina said from across the room, not looking up from her laptop. During that 40 seconds, a remote access credential was installed. Whoever is running this from Lucian's side has partial access to the building's security architecture. She looked up. Don't use the automated locks. They may be able to override them. Use the physical ones. Dante grabbed his radio and told the 2 men in the sub-level to engage the manual deadbolts on the corridor access doors. Then he looked at the camera feed, showing the 2 dark vehicles idling near the North Service entrance, and thought about his father. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stopped. Prentice, he said, I'm going to the lobby. I want 4 men with me. The remaining 8 hold the sub-level access points and the evidence archive. Nobody fires first. Nobody initiates. I want Lucian inside this building and talking before anything physical happens. Prentice looked at him. You want him inside. I want him in a room where there are cameras and a live audio feed transmitting to a federal contact. I want every word he says from this point forward on record. He picked up his jacket. Can you get the feed live to Serafina's federal contact? Serafina's hands were already moving on the laptop. 40 seconds. It took 38. She looked up and nodded. Dante walked to the lobby. He was standing in the center of the lobby floor, alone, when the North Service door opened and Lucian Rook walked in ahead of 4 men who were not family soldiers. They were dressed in the anonymous dark clothing of contractors, people paid for a specific outcome and not for continuity. Lucian himself was in a suit. He was always in a suit. He looked at Dante, standing in the middle of the lobby floor, with the specific expression of a man who had planned for several scenarios and was currently determining which one this was. Dante, he said. His voice was exactly as it always was. That was the most disturbing thing. There was no register of guilt or exposure in it. He sounded like a man arriving for a scheduled meeting. Lucian. Dante kept his hands loose at his sides. You want to tell me what these men are for? Security. Lucian came forward 2 steps. The 4 men behind him fanned out slightly, which was a trained response and not a family soldier's habit. There's been a threat assessment, suggesting the building may be targeted tonight. I took the initiative. A threat assessment from whom? Internal sources. You bypassed. Prentice reports to you. Some situations require independent judgment. Lucian stopped 12 feet from Dante. He was reading the room the way he always read rooms, systematically, without appearing to. His eyes moved across the lobby, cataloging exits, positions, the absence of visible backup. Where is everyone? On assignment, Dante said. On a Thursday night at midnight. It's been an unusual week. Dante looked at him steadily. Carver Wells called me tonight. The lobby was very quiet. One of the contractors behind Lucian shifted his weight and then stilled himself. Lucian's expression underwent something small and precise, not collapse, not shock, but the microscopic recalibration of a man who has just had his risk calculus changed by an unexpected variable. That's unfortunate, Lucian said. His voice was exactly the same. He was very forthcoming about the arrangement, about the rerouting of his payments. Dante took 1 step forward. About my father, Dante, don't. His voice cracked at the edges with something he had been holding since the parking structure and that was not willing to stay held any longer. Don't manage me. Don't calibrate what you're about to say. I am not a variable. I am not a position to be held. I am the man whose father you killed, and I am standing in the building you came tonight to destroy. And I am telling you that every word you have spoken in your home office in the past 2 hours has been transmitted to a federal contact in a district that has no relationship to any of your protections. Lucian's jaw tightened, just slightly. That's not possible. Serafina has had a device in your office for 6 weeks. The silence after that was the loudest thing Dante had ever heard. He watched Lucian Rook process the information, the sequence of it, the implications cascading from each piece, and watched the silver-haired composure undergo something it had probably not undergone in decades. Not breaking. Men like Lucian don't break in a moment. But bending, the posture shifted a degree. The hands, always so still, moved briefly. The transmission is already done, Dante said. The originals are already secured. What you came here to take doesn't exist in the form you expected it to exist in anymore. He paused. So you can tell these men to leave. Or you can make this into something it doesn't need to be. Lucian looked at him for a long moment. Then, very quietly, you don't understand what you've started. Tell me, Wells is not your ally. He never was. The man is protecting himself, which is the only thing he has ever done. He told you about me because I became inconvenient to him, not because he has any interest in your welfare. Lucian's voice was still even, still precise. The voice of a man making an argument he genuinely believes. The federal contact your wife has been cultivating. Do you know who that person's senior supervisor is? Do you know whose district that office operates in? Because I do. And I can tell you that the transmission you believe is secured is currently sitting in an inbox belonging to someone who's going to call a specific number the moment he reads the subject line. And that specific number belongs to a man who owes his position to the same network that built your organization. Dante stared at him. You've been 3 moves ahead your entire career, Lucian said. You've been 3 moves behind this conversation. He spread his hands, the gesture of a man being reasonable. This doesn't have to end in a federal case. It doesn't have to end in violence. I built this organization the way I built it because your father asked me to, because the family needed a foundation that could withstand pressure that would have destroyed it otherwise. Everything I did. You killed him, Dante said. Lucian stopped. Everything you did includes that. Dante's voice was flat and low and without heat, which was worse than shouting. So don't stand in my building and me about foundations and pressure. Tell me what you did and why you thought you could. The lobby was silent. The contractors behind Lucian were reading the situation. Dante could see it, in the way they held themselves, the slight uncertainty in the formation. They had been hired for an extraction operation, not for a confrontation with the principle of the organization they were entering. The variables were not what they'd been briefed on. Then the door to Dante's left opened, and Prentice walked in with 6 men, moving in from the east corridor, and the door behind Lucian opened simultaneously, and 4 more came through from the service wing, and in the space of about 4 seconds, the geometry of the lobby changed entirely. Lucian's 4 contractors found themselves outnumbered more than 2 to 1 in a building whose exits were no longer as accessible as they had appeared. One of the contractors reached toward his jacket. Don't, Prentice said. The word landed in the lobby like a physical object. Contractor's hand stilled. Lucian looked around the room. He was doing the mathematics, and the mathematics were not in his favor, and he knew it. And Dante could see the moment of acceptance move through him, the moment a man who has operated from a position of control for a very long time recognizes that the position has shifted, and that managing the shift is now the only available action. The evidence in the federal system, Dante said. However compromised you think that transmission point is, Serafina built redundancy. There are 2 contacts, 2 districts, 2 senior supervisors. He held Lucian's eyes. She built redundancy because she doesn't trust single points of failure. She learned that from watching you. Something moved across Lucian's face. For just a moment, a second, maybe less, it was something that Dante could not categorize with certainty, but that looked, around the eyes, like a species of grief. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed silver mask. That was the face Lucian showed the world. The recording, Lucian said quietly. The one from my office. What does it contain? Enough. Specifically, Dante held his gaze. Your conversation with Hargrove about my father's timeline. You used the word method. Lucian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, he said nothing. He stood in the lobby of a building he had spent years treating as an extension of his own authority, and he said nothing. And that silence was its own confession. From the corridor behind Dante, the sound of movement. Serafina appeared at the lobby entrance, the leather case in one hand and her laptop in the other. She took in the room with the same systematic assessment she had given the operations room, and walked to Dante's side without haste or drama. She looked at Lucian. Lucian looked back. In the 28 years he had served the Veyron family, across the entire architecture of what he had built and managed and manipulated, Serafina Vale was the variable he had underestimated. She was not supposed to have been able to build what she built. She was not supposed to have been patient enough, connected enough, or systematically thorough enough to document 12 years of hidden infrastructure from the inside of the marriage he had engineered. He had looked at her and seen a complication. She had looked at him and seen the center of the problem. "It's over," she said, not triumphantly, just as a statement of current conditions. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. "You found the ledger," he said. It wasn't a question. "I found everything," she said. One of the contractors made a decision that was either brave or stupid, depending on how it ended moved. Suddenly and with commitment toward the east corridor exit. He made it 4 steps before Prentice's men closed the angle, and the man found himself facing a wall of people who were much calmer than he was and much better positioned. Stopped. Lucian watched this without moving and then turned back to Dante. "The elders," he said. "Hargrove and Steen. They'll deny everything." "They're on the recording," Dante said. "They have lawyers who have been managing relationships with federal overstructure for decades. So does Serafina's contact," Dante said. "Different relationships. Different structures. That's what 2 districts means, Lucian." Contractors were being collected by Prentice's men, with the practiced efficiency of people doing something they had prepared for. Lucian stood alone in the center of the lobby, the 4 men who had come in with him now separated and controlled, and the building was quiet around him except for the low sounds of a situation being managed by people who knew what they were doing. Lucian turned his eyes to the ceiling. It was not a dramatic gesture. He wasn't a theatrical man. The movement of a person's eyes when they are thinking about something very far away from the room they currently in. He stayed like that for a moment. Then he looked back at Dante and said the truest thing he had said all night. "You were supposed to be easier than your father," he said. "I made you easier than your father. I shaped every variable that reached you. And you still found a way to become someone I couldn't fully predict." He glanced at Serafina. "Because of her. You found a way because of her, and you didn't even know she was the reason." "I know now," Dante said. Lucian nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he had suspected for a long time. Then he straightened his jacket, which was the automatic dignity of muscle memory, and stood quietly, while Prentice stepped forward to take control of the situation. Serafina put her hand on Dante's arm, not his hand. His arm a contact point, warm and brief, that said something he didn't have words for yet, and that she didn't seem to need him to have words for. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her face changed. "The second federal contact," she said. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was processing something fast. "There's a problem with the transmission." She looked up at Dante. "The supervisor that Lucian mentioned, the compromised one, he's the senior supervisor for both districts." The lobby went very quiet. Dante looked at her. "You said redundancy." "I built redundancy across 2 channels," she said. "I did not know both channels had the same senior supervisor." Her jaw was tight. The transmission reached both contacts. The supervising authority above both of them is the same man. Which means Lucian is right that it's sitting in a system that has a single compromised point above it, a point with enough authority to suppress or redirect before it reaches anyone who can act on it. She held his gaze. "We have approximately." She checked the phone. 20 minutes before the business day begins in that time zone and the supervisor reaches his office. 20 minutes. The evidence transmitted. The originals in the case. Lucian standing 20 feet away, controlled but not yet formally contained. 2 federal contacts with a compromised superior. 20 minutes before that superior could redirect or suppress. Dante looked at Serafina. "Winters," he said. "My contact." "What district?" "Different supervisor," she said immediately. "You checked." "I checked everyone's supervisor before I built the parallel track," she said, with the precise exhaustion of a woman who has thought of almost everything and is currently dealing with the one thing she did not think of. "Winters is clean, but Winters doesn't have the full transmission. He only has what you previously shared with him, which is preliminary. How fast can Bellamy transmit the full package to Winters?" She was already dialing. Dante turned to Prentice. "Nobody leaves this building. Lucian, the contractors. Everyone stays until Serafina tells me the transmission is confirmed." He looked across the lobby at Lucian, who was standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Dante, with the expression of a man watching a situation. develop that he no longer has any leverage over, but that still holds his complete attention. 19 minutes, Dante said, to no one in particular. Serafina had Bellamy on the phone. She was talking fast and low. The phone pressed hard against her ear, moving toward the corridor where the signal was better, and Dante watched her go with the specific feeling of a man who has placed every chip he has on a single point and is watching the wheels spin. Prentice appeared at his shoulder. "The elders," he said quietly. "Hargrove and Steen. They're not in this building." "No. If the transmission gets suppressed before Winters receives the full package." "I know. Then we're holding Lucian without formal grounds that can be substantiated outside this organization, and Hargrove and Steen walk, and whatever they have with the compromised supervisors." "Prentice." Dante looked at him. "I know." They stood together in the quiet lobby and waited, and the building settled around them with the particular silence of a place where something enormous has just occurred, and the reverberations are still moving through the walls. And Dante counted the seconds without meaning to, because some things you can't stop your body from doing. And somewhere in the corridor, Serafina was talking fast into a phone, and Lucian Rook stood in the center of the lobby floor, with his jacket still straight and his face still composed, watching everything with the eyes of a man who understood that the margin had become very thin and that the next few minutes would determine which side of it everyone ended up on. Serafina came back into the lobby at the 14-minute mark. Dante read her face before she spoke, the way you learn to read a face after 7 years of sharing space with it. Not the expression she was showing, but the one underneath it, the real-time feed of what was actually happening behind her eyes. What he saw was not relief. It was something more complicated than relief. It was the face of a person who had just been handed a partial victory and was already calculating the cost of the part that wasn't. "Bellamy got the full package to Winters," she said. She stopped in front of him and held his gaze steadily. "Winters confirmed receipt and is moving it up through his chain. His supervisor is clean. It's in the right hands." "But," Dante said, "but the first transmission, the 2 compromised contacts, the senior supervisor got to his office early." She paused. 14 minutes early. He accessed the inbox 6 minutes ago. The lobby was absolutely still. "He's seen it," Dante said. "He's seen it, which means he's already on the phone with someone, and whoever that someone is. They're now aware that a comprehensive evidence package, documenting Lucian's operation, the Wells arrangement, the Elder conspiracy, and your father's death has been received by at least one federal authority that he cannot control." She watched him absorb this. He can suppress the 2 compromised contacts. He cannot suppress Winters. What he can do is warn the people named in the documentation that federal scrutiny is coming, which gives them time to begin moving assets and restructuring appearances. "Hargrove and Steen," Dante said in Wells. She said it carefully. "Wells gave you information tonight because Lucian became inconvenient, but Wells is in that documentation. His arrangement with your father, the government connections, the payments. Winters has all of it, which means Wells is now as exposed as everyone else, and a man with Wells's resources and connections, given even 40 minutes of warning. He runs," Dante said. "He's probably already running." Dante turned this over. The lobby was quiet around him. Prentice and his men holding the contractors. Lucian standing separate and controlled, the building settling into the specific silence that follows violent motion. He thought about Wells's voice on the phone. The measured cadence, the practiced calm, the 11 minutes of information, delivered with the generosity of a man who needed an ally and was purchasing one. He had used Dante the way Lucian had used Dante as a piece, positioned and moved. The difference was that Wells had used him once, tonight, for a specific purpose, and Lucian had been doing it for 20 years. "Can Winters move fast enough?" Dante said. "He's already filed for emergency preservation orders on all named accounts. That part is done. The money doesn't move regardless of what the compromised supervisor does." She paused. "Wells's physical person is a different question. That's outside Winters' immediate jurisdiction. What about the government contacts Wells had? The relationships that protected the organization for 2 decades, named in the documentation, every one of them." She held his gaze. "Winters is thorough. I spent 7 months making sure of that, a breath. Some of those people are going to have very difficult mornings. Dante looked across the lobby at Lucian. Lucian was watching him with the attention of a man who understood that the conversation happening on the other side of the room was determining the rest of his life, and who had run out of moves to influence it. His jacket was still straight. He would die with his jacket straight. Dante understood that about him clearly for the first time, and it produced something that was not sympathy, but was in the same family the recognition of a man entirely, utterly himself at the moment of his defeat. He crossed the lobby. He stopped in front of Lucian and looked at him at close range, which he had done thousands of times over 20 years, and which felt, now, like looking at a landscape he had memorized without ever understanding its actual geography. "My father," Dante said, quietly, so it stayed between them. Lucian met his eyes. "Yes." "Did he—" Dante stopped, started again. "Did he know what you were? What you were building underneath everything?" Lucian was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet. The distinction was visible. "Your father was a complicated man," he said finally. "He built something he didn't fully understand, and then handed it to you and died before either of you could have the conversation that might have changed what happened next." He paused. "He didn't know what I was doing, but he would have recognized it if he'd had more time. He was not naive, but he's not here to recognize anything," Dante said. "No," Lucian said, "he's not." They stood facing each other for another moment. Then Dante stepped back and nodded to Prentice, and Prentice moved forward, and Lucian Rook went with him, without resistance, not because he lacked the will, but because he had done the mathematics, and the mathematics no longer offered any options worth taking. He walked out of the lobby of the building he had managed from the shadows for 20 years, with his back straight, and his jaw set and his jacket perfectly straight. And Dante watched him go and felt the specific hollowness of a conclusion that cost more than victory is supposed to cost. By 3 in the morning, the building had been cleared, documented, and handed to a process larger than any of them. Winters's people arrived at 3:40, a small team, professional and understated, the kind of federal presence that does not announce itself with noise. They took statements, collected copies of the physical documentation, and moved through the space with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood the scope of what they were handling. Dante cooperated completely. He had decided somewhere in the lobby during the 14-minute count that complete cooperation was the only posture available to him, not because he had no other options, but because Serafina had been building toward this outcome for 3 years, and the outcome required its full weight behind it rather than the partial, self-protective cooperation of a man trying to preserve pieces of what he had. The elders were the next complication, and the most immediate one. Hargrove and Steen had received warning from the compromised supervisor. That much became clear when Winters's team attempted to reach them at their respective residences, and found both men unreachable. Hargrove's house was empty, cleanly so, with no signs of hurried departure. Steen's assistant answered the phone, and said he had traveled for a family matter and would be available early next week, which was a lie told with the smooth, professional affect of someone who had been coached in the past hour to say exactly that. Dante told Winters this, and Winters told him it wasn't unexpected. Preservation orders on the financial accounts had already been executed, which meant wherever Hargrove and Steen went, the resources they had counted on were no longer available to them in any usable form. Running with frozen assets, Winters explained, in the flat language of a man who had seen this scenario before, rarely lasted more than a few weeks before the practical difficulties of existence without liquidity produced a conversation. Carver Wells was the one that didn't resolve cleanly. Winters's team confirmed he had moved from his location within hours of the transmission reaching the compromised supervisor, which meant someone had reached him faster than Dante had anticipated. He was gone in the way that men with decades of practice disappearing are gone thoroughly, without traceable trajectory. The accounts in his name were frozen. His government contacts were named in the documentation would spend the next several months in the particular discomfort of federal scrutiny. The man himself was a loose thread that would not be tied off tonight, or this week, or perhaps for a considerable time. Serafina, when Dante told her, was quiet for a moment. "I always knew he might run," she said. "He's been running from something for 14 years. What he's best at." She looked at the window. "The accounts are frozen." His network is named. The relationships that made him untouchable are now a liability rather than a protection. She turned back. He's gone, but he's not free. Those aren't the same thing. At 5 in the morning, with Wintz's team still working through the building, and the first gray light beginning at the edges of the sky outside, Dante went to the secure room on the floor below the penthouse. Maribel was awake, sitting in the single chair in the room, with her knees pulled up and her phone in her hand. She looked up when he opened the door, and the question on her face was only one question, even though it contained several. "He's in custody," Dante said. She exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that comes from somewhere very deep, and that has been held for a long time. Paul. Paul is with Prentice's people. He's been seen by a doctor. He's okay. He leaned against the doorframe. He's been asking about you. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. The gesture was quick, and she controlled it fast, but it was real, genuinely real. The first thing he had seen from her that was completely unmanaged and unperformed, and it looked exactly like what it was, which was a woman who had been holding herself together under extreme pressure for a very long time and was beginning carefully to let some of that go. "I need to see him," she said. "I know. We'll make that happen in the next few hours." He looked at her. "After that, we need to talk about what comes next for you. Federal team is going to want a statement. You're a material witness. Your cooperation, I'll cooperate fully," she said immediately. No hesitation. Everything. Every call, every instruction, every piece of the plan I was told. All of it. She met his eyes. "I should have found a way to tell you sooner." "I know that. You were protecting your brother." "That's true. It's also a reason, not an excuse." She said it plainly, in the tone of a woman who has been sitting alone in a quiet room for several hours, working through the exact moral geography of her own choices. "There's a difference." He nodded. He had nothing to offer her that was better than the acknowledgement that she was right, so he offered that and left her to the rest of the night. He found Serafina on the building's roof at 5:30. She was standing at the east edge, looking at the city as the darkness began its slow negotiation with morning, and the leather case was on the roof beside her feet. Empty now, its contents distributed to the federal team and to Winters, and to the permanent record of a case that would take months or years to fully process. She had her arms crossed against the cold, and her hair was coming loose from where she had pinned it hours ago, and she looked tired in a way that was not the performed composure she wore in public, but the real thing, bone deep, the exhaustion of a person who has been running hard for 3 years and has only just in the last hour been able to stop. Came to stand beside her. Not too close. The correct distance for two people who had been through what they had been through and who were standing on the other side of it without yet knowing what the other side looked like. They were quiet for a while. The city was beginning to shift from night sounds to early morning sounds, the first vehicles, the ambient machinery of a place coming back to life. Dante reached into his jacket pocket. He set her wedding ring on the metal railing between them. He didn't say anything when he did it. He had thought about this moment in the car and had prepared several things to say, and when the actual moment arrived, none of them were the right shape. She looked at the ring on the railing. She didn't touch it. "I chose wrong," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You chose what they built you to choose." Her voice was not generous, it was accurate. "They selected Maribel because they knew your patterns. They knew what would hold your attention and what kind of appeal would move you past your better judgment. The choice felt like yours because it was designed to feel like yours. That's generous." "It's not generous. It's just true." She looked at him briefly and then back at the city. "You also have a pattern of mistaking a woman's patience for passivity. That part is yours. I know. And a pattern of deciding you understand a situation before you've gathered the information. I know that too. And a tendency to trust institutional loyalty over demonstrable evidence when the loyalty comes from someone who has been there long enough to feel permanent. Are you going to keep going?" "I have a fairly comprehensive list," she said. Corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. He looked at the ring on the railing. "I didn't understand what you were doing. Not the scope of it. Not what it cost you to do it the way you did." He paused. "I should have been someone you could bring this to earlier." Quiet for a long moment. "Maybe," she said. "And maybe if I had brought it to you earlier, we would have moved before we had enough. and Lucien would have buried it, and we would not be standing here. She looked at the ring. I've been running that calculation for 3 years. I don't know the answer. Neither do I, he said. I think that's the honest version. She picked up the ring from the railing. She held it in her palm and looked at it, this small piece of metal that had been on her finger for 7 years, and that she had set on a white tablecloth in a ballroom full of people. A gesture that had looked like an ending and turned out to be the beginning of the last act of something much larger. She did not put it on. She held it. I am not the woman who stands behind you, she said. I know. If I come back to this, she stopped. Revised. If I choose to stay in any capacity inside what this organization is going to need to become, it will be as an equal party. Not an advisor, not a partner, in the quiet sense that everyone understands means assistant. An equal party. My decisions carry the same weight as yours. My read of a situation is taken seriously, rather than listened to politely and then set aside. Yes, Dante said. That's not a negotiating position. I'm not asking you to consider it. I understand that. I've spent 7 years inside a world that consistently underestimated me, and I used that underestimation strategically because it was the only tool available. I am not willing to go back to being underestimated even by you. She looked at him directly. Especially by you. He held her gaze. I know what you did. I know what it took. I know what the cost was. He paused. I am not asking you to forgive a version of me that isn't going to exist anymore. I am asking you to assess whatever version of me is standing here right now and decide whether it's worth your time. Quiet for a considerable while. The city below was getting louder by increments. A delivery truck somewhere. The sound of a train in the far distance. I don't know yet, she said. That's the honest answer. Okay, he said. She closed her fingers around the ring, not putting it on, not putting it down, just holding it, which was its own kind of statement about where things stood, neither concluded nor abandoned. They stood on the roof until the sun cleared the buildings to the east and the light changed from gray to something warmer, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was the most honest conversation they had had in years. The weeks that followed were not easy and not dramatic. Mostly they were procedural and exhausting, in the way that the aftermath of large events is always exhausting. Not the cinematic exhaustion of aftermath, but the administrative, grinding, relentless exhaustion of cleaning up something that reached into every corner of a complex structure. Winters's case expanded. Names were added to the documentation. 2 members of the federal system connected to the compromised supervisor resigned quietly, which was noted in the case record as an indicator of consciousness of guilt. Hargrove was located in Portugal 3 weeks after the building. He cooperated partially in exchange for considerations that Dante was not privy to and did not need to be. Dean remained missing for 11 days and then appeared through his attorney with a willingness to provide testimony that the attorney characterized as comprehensive. The attorney was lying. Steen's testimony was selective and self-serving, but it contained enough to be useful, which in the context of the broader case was sufficient. Lucien did not cooperate. This was not surprising. He retained attorneys immediately, said nothing, and sat with the particular composure of a man who had prepared for this possibility long ago, and had made a decision about how he intended to conduct himself in it. He said nothing about Dante's father in the formal proceedings, which meant the evidence had to carry that element of the case without his confirmation. Winters told Dante it was enough. Dante believed him, but also understood that enough was a word that contained a considerable amount of ambiguity when applied to the death of someone you loved. Maribel gave her statement over 3 sessions, each one more detailed than the last, as the formal environment established itself as genuinely protected space. She described every call, every instruction, every piece of information she had been asked to extract and deliver. Described the specific language Lucien had used when Paul was first taken, the tone of it, the careful implicit threat wrapped in the vocabulary of reassurance. Her testimony was precise and consistent, and she gave it without self-pity, which Winters noted privately to Dante as significant. She was not prosecuted. Consideration she received in exchange for her testimony included relocation assistance for herself and Paul new city, clean start, the kind of institutional disappearance that is performed by people who understand how to make lives invisible. She thanked Dante formally in a letter that arrived 2 weeks after she left, and the letter was brief and dignified and said what needed to be said without saying more than that. He read it once and put it away. The organization went through its restructuring in the months that followed, which was the piece that required Serafina most directly, and that she engaged with in the way she engaged with everything. Methodically, without announcement, with a thoroughness that repeatedly surprised people who had formed conclusions about her before gathering sufficient evidence. She returned not to the penthouse, but to an office 2 floors below it, which she had retrofitted into a functional working space, where she kept her own hours and managed her own calendar and answered to no one's schedule but the work itself. She and Dante met daily, professionally, and separately from whatever else was developing between them, or not developing, or developing slowly in the way that things develop between 2 people who have been through something extreme and are not in a hurry to pretend it left them unchanged. She eliminated the shadow advisory structure that Lucien had maintained. She did this by identifying each member of the parallel network, documenting their involvement, and offering each one a specific choice, a clean exit with no further entanglement, or a formal process with consequences. Most chose the exit. The few who didn't were handled by Winters's case, which absorbed them with the impartiality of a process that had stopped being personal and become institutional. Captains who had been compromised by Lucien's small regular payments, the 17 men on Bellamy's list, were addressed individually. Some of them hadn't understood what the payments meant. Some of them had understood perfectly. Serafina met with each one personally, which was not the expected approach, and the meetings were not comfortable because she had no interest in making them comfortable. She asked each man to account for himself. She listened to the accounts. She made determinations that were not identical, because the situations were not identical, and she recorded her reasoning in documentation that remained in the organization's permanent file. Dante reviewed her determinations without overriding any of them. He disagreed with 2 of them, told her so directly, and she explained her reasoning for both, and at the end of both conversations he understood her reasoning well enough to recognize that his disagreement conclusion was not with her conclusions, but with his own discomfort at the conclusions, which was a different thing. They disagreed more than they had in 7 years of marriage. That was the unexpected development, the one that neither of them had anticipated. With the performed version of their relationship, gone the arrangement that had been shaped partly by Lucien's manipulation and partly by their own failure to be honest about what they needed from each other. What remained was 2 people who had strong and sometimes incompatible views on how to do things, and who were no longer willing to manage the incompatibility through silence. They argued about the restructuring timeline, about which captains could be rehabilitated and which couldn't, about the Wells situation and whether to invest resources in finding him or to accept that he was gone and focus on what could actually be resolved. The arguments were not gentle. Serafina did not soften her positions for the sake of ease, and Dante did not defer for the sake of peace. And somehow the thing that was growing back between them was built out of those arguments rather than in spite of them. First family meeting under the new structure was held 6 weeks after the night in the building. Dante had redesigned the table configuration. He removed the single chair at the head, the chair his father had sat in, and that he had inherited, and that Lucien had stood beside for 28 years, shaping what reached the person sitting in it. He placed 2 chairs side by side where the head chair had been. He did not explain the symbolism when the captains and advisors filed in and took their places. He didn't need to. The people in that room understood what a table says, about who is in charge of it. Serafina was the last to enter. She came in from the corridor that connected to her office, in her own clothes, on her own time. She looked at the 2 chairs. She looked at Dante. Something passed between them that was not a moment of romantic resolution. It was more practical than that, more loaded with the specific weight of 2 people who have been through something real and are deciding, deliberately and without illusion, to keep going. She sat in one of the chairs. Dante sat in the other. He opened the meeting by placing on the table a single document, a 1-page record of everything that the organization had been doing in the shadows for 12 years, stripped of names and specifics, presented as a statement of the structure that had existed and no longer would. He did not read it aloud. He let it sit on the table. Then he said the only thing he had prepared to say. This is what we built without knowing we were building it. The meeting today is about what we build instead. He said nothing about Lucian. He said nothing about the elders or the contractors or the federal case or the weeks of procedural exhaustion that had led to this room. The people in the room had lived through the consequences. They didn't need a summary. They needed a direction. Serafina spoke next, for 18 minutes, about the new advisory structure, the checks on single-point influence, the documentation requirements for any recommendation that reached Dante, the rotation of advisory roles that would ensure no individual could accumulate the kind of unchecked institutional trust that Lucian had built over decades. She spoke with the specificity of someone who had been designing this for years and was now, finally, delivering it to the room it was designed for. Nobody interrupted her. The room was very quiet in the way a room is quiet when the people inside it are actually listening. After the meeting, Dante stayed in the room while the others filed out. Serafina stayed too, gathering the document she had brought, and for a few minutes they were alone in the room that had been the center of things, for as long as either of them could remember. Carver Wells, Dante said. She looked up from the documents. She had known the name was coming. Winters got a ping on a financial account 3 days ago, he said. Overseas. A small transaction small enough to be a mistake or a test. Winters thinks it's a test. He thinks Wells is checking what's been frozen and what hasn't. He's trying to understand the perimeter of the exposure. Serafina said, yes, which means he's still out there, and he's still thinking about coming back in from somewhere. Dante looked at the table. Doesn't resolve cleanly. No, she said. It doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. Some things don't. That's the true version of how this ends, most of it resolved. Some of it ongoing. None of it as clean as it looked when it was still theoretical. She held his gaze. Wells will make a mistake eventually. Men who run get tired. Tired men stop being as careful as they need to be. She paused. Winters will be watching. Dante nodded. It was not a satisfying conclusion. He had grown up in a world that valued the complete resolution of problems, the clean accounting, the closed account, the finished business. The version of this ending that he had available to him was not that. Wells was loose. The compromised federal supervisor was under investigation, but not yet formally charged. The case would run for another year minimum before anything approaching a final shape was visible. That was the actual landscape of the thing he was inside. Not a movie ending, but a process, messy and ongoing, that would require sustained attention for a long time. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. She was still at the table, papers in hand, about to leave for her own office and her own afternoon, and the work that had no end to it. I was thinking about the rooftop, he said. She looked at him. Not tonight. Maybe this weekend. If the weather, he stopped, started again. I'd like to have a conversation that isn't about the organization. If you want to. She looked at him for a moment with the direct, unhurried assessment that was the most honest thing about her. The gaze that did not perform consideration, but actually performed it. That took in the question, and the person asking it, and weighed them against whatever she carried inside her. That functioned as a compass. Saturday, she said. He nodded. She walked out. He stood alone in the restructured room, with the 2 equal chairs side by side at the head of the table, and the morning light coming through the east windows, and he thought about his father as he had been thinking about his father in every quiet moment since the parking structure. He thought about what it meant to have been handed, a thing that was already compromised before you touched it, to have lived inside a structure that had been shaped by other people's intentions without your knowledge. He thought about the choices that had felt like his and the choices that had actually been his, and the work of actually been his, and the distinguishing between them, which was going to take longer than any investigation and couldn't be handed to anyone else to carry. He put on his jacket. He straightened it. Not because he cared about the jacket, but because it was what the hands do when the mind is very full and needs the body to do something simple and conclusive. He turned off the light in the room and walked out into the building that was actually his, for the first time.